feeling stressed often comes from a disparity between how much we perceive there to be a risk or difficulty or threat to us, and how much we perceive our resource to cope with that threat or difficulty or risk. And if there is a mismatch between those two, if it feels like the risk and the threat is really big and we just don't have the resource to cope with it, then that can feel very stressful. The opposite's also sometimes true, that if we feel like, okay, there's a risk, there's a difficulty, there's a threat, but we feel like we've got a big resource to cope with it, like there's a lot of stuff, of skill, of time, of money, or whatever that resource is going to take to cope with it, then we can often feel, yeah, great, in control, or even up for the challenge, might even feel quite exciting. So it's why sometimes we can feel we have some challenge comes along at work and we cope with it brilliantly, but a challenge can come along elsewhere and it may not feel like that big a challenge, and we perceive it as incredibly stressful. And that's because if we don't feel like we've got the resource to cope with that risk or that threat, or we can't tell how big that risk or that problem is going to be, then it can feel very difficult to be confident that we can manage it, and that becomes stressful. So usually the way that we have to kind of approach this is either to understand, to try and minimise, to try and chip away at or work on that stress in some way, what the threat and the risk is, so that we bring the stress level down because we feel more able to understand and cope and contain the risk, or we build up our resource to cope, our sense of being able to handle it, or both. If we can do this at the same time, that we build the resource and we chip away at the size of the risk, the thing that makes us feel like we're not coping, then the stress level that we perceive from that will drop down. So that's the two things that we're trying to do, both understand and contain the risk and the threat if we can, and build up our resources to cope with it if we can't, and sometimes also to just acknowledge this may be a risk or a threat that isn't going away right now, or that we can't contain, or that we can't fix. And so then it's about what are our resources to cope until we can, or until something shifts and we feel better. And quite often that may be about not doing it on your own, getting support, getting other people in to help, finding strategies that work for you to help make that feel manageable and containable.